Welcome everybody. Good afternoon in the UK and good evening from us in Australia. My name is Mark Bowie. I'm Director of Palliative Medicine at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, but I'm also on the executive of the International Collaborative for Best Care for the Dying Person. Tonight we're speaking on the topic of dying in the digital age and really asking you the question, and our speakers the question, are you prepared? And initially, when we have conversations like this in Australia, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are speaking on and working from today. And I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional elders of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who sits here around the countries around the Yarra River, Melbourne, and sort of south and southern Victoria. And so to welcome you to the webinar this afternoon or this evening. First up, we're going to just introduce a little bit about the International Collaborative for those who are new to the webinar, and just to remind others that there are 6 continents of the globe with 203 members in the collaborative. The vision of the collaborative is a world where people are going to experience a good death as an integral part of their individual life, supported by the very best personalised care. As you may know, the International Collaborative and its international footprint is very much around the model of the care plan for the dying, so the best care for the dying person, the 1040 model. But there's a huge program of research and development, quality assurance programs, and learning and teaching for those of you who are interested in focusing on this aspect of people's lives. If you can, as we're presenting, if you've got any questions and would like to put them into the chat function, please do, and we'll talk at the end of the presentation. So initially we'll have the 2 presentations, and then we'll have the chat in the 10 or 15 minutes that are left at the end of the conversation. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Bjorn Nansen. Bjorn Nansen's actually at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and he's a researcher in digital technology in family life and a member of the DefTech research team who I've actually been doing some work with and exploring questions in the intersection of death and technology. He's been authors on a number of publications, which you can see in his bio, and in particular focus on the emerging socio-technical practices, and current projects are investigating family tracking technologies and digital memorialising. So it's a really good start to the webinar today to have Bjorn speaking with us. Thank you, Bjorn.
Okay, I'll just share my screen one moment. Okay, great. Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Centre for Palliative Care in Liverpool and the International Collaboration for the invitation to speak with you today and this evening. As with Mark, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm presenting, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. Yeah, I'd like to thank the organisers for the invitation. And just to note that I have no affiliation or funding from any of the companies I'll be mentioning in this talk today. And so the talk I'll be giving is, as you can see from the title, Navigating the Business of Death Online, so planning for managing digital remains, assets, and memorialization. Yeah, so, you know, the intersection of death and memorializing and the internet and even older technologies and other technologies is not necessarily a new thing. We can see examples of early memorial websites from the 90s, created by individuals. Certainly there wasn't a lot of them, but they certainly existed at this time. But what's happened since that time, obviously, is the explosion in our, digital activities and digital data and lives, and what that leaves behind. And so what I want to focus on is a few different elements of that today, thinking about digital assets, online memorialization, posthumous participation, and digital estate legislation. noting that I'm from the social sciences and not the medical sciences. And also that in some ways, I'm sure to many of you, many of these things that I'll be talking about are familiar. Nonetheless, perhaps an overview and a refresher perhaps. Okay, so yeah, so since the 90s and early web pages, that explosion of data and data left by those who die has certainly prompted an increasing attention from a range of stakeholders, including legal firms and legal advice about what to do with those digital assets. There's different words for this, obviously, our digital remains, digital records, digital assets, or digital legacy. So there's different kind of words, and even here we can see digital wealth. So we can see different kind of terminology used to try to kind of understand, well, what is the sort of scope of the digital data, the digital records that we leave behind that may have value, whether sentimental, personal, emotional, or financial. And so these kind of definitions, as you could imagine, try to encompass, you know, our photos, our videos, our music libraries, our social media accounts, you know, if we have websites or financial accounts and banking accounts and purchasing accounts, through to all kinds of documents that might be stored in you know, on hard drives or on computers or on the internet or in the cloud. It may include it may include data that we have created, that we own, but also may include accounts that we have not necessarily proprietary ownership over that content, but we have a license to access. So we can think about different kinds of streaming accounts or music accounts, things like Spotify, where we might not necessarily own the asset, but we own the account that accesses that, which can have important kind of you know, important and meaningful kinds of information on it, such as, you know, playlists that people have created for important music to them, even though they might not own the actual musical record itself. So you can see it starts to get complicated once you start to think about that and then move into sort of other areas such as, you know, emerging things, which I think we'll be hearing a bit further later about, NFTs and so forth. So certainly the scope is continuing to grow. And the advice that people are providing around that is also evolving. We can see certainly the sort of trend towards encouraging people to think about their digital assets and what they want done with them. And the advice tends to be now to create a record of those, to identify them, to create a record, to decide what you want done with those different accounts. Whether you want to pass on certain, you know, important photos to certain people, whether you want certain accounts deleted or others memorialized, to nominate somebody to look after that, so that to register those assets, and to nominate someone to look after them, like an executor in a will, and to leave a record of that. And part of that the current advice is very much around passwords and password access, because as we know, one of the current problems, and I'll get to this later, is that there's different terms of service and different policies around who has rights to access data that complicate this both jurisdictionally, but also across different kinds of digital platforms and services. And so the current advice is, you know, if you give access through the password, that gives the kind of best options for people who have received those assets. In addition to obviously legal advice, I think the UK is probably in many ways leading in this. There's a whole range of organisations, associations, not-for-profits and social enterprises who are providing resources online for people to kind of you know, find out about these issues and to address them. So we can, the Digital Legacy Association, for example, or Dead Social, who are both kind of interesting, and you know, there's others of course as well, but I think in terms of providing resources around planning, and so that idea of a estate management and a digital legacy and managing that, but also beyond that, so looking at guides for how you can shut down or access or manage accounts on different social media platforms, through to other kinds of advice around, how to prepare for a funeral, how to create a playlist, how to create a slideshow, and so on and so on. So very much kind of creating publicly available materials that can help people for managing that digital legacy and assets planning. Of course, it's not just legal advice or communities and associations providing advice, but of course corporate and commercial products and services are being made available in this space as well, and these offer similar kinds of advice, but also build on that kind of advice by providing services like creating like a locker, a place where you can store your digital will, your digital assets, your, what you want done with them, all those passwords and so on, obviously at a cost, along with giving advice, as we can see here from Everplans, who are based in the US, who have a very extensive list about different accounts and how, online services and how to close them, how to create that digital estate planning that I just mentioned, including extending beyond that to think about, more nuanced kind of elements of that, like not just how to pass on or delete, but, how you might go about getting rid of or deleting information that might be considered sensitive. For example, things like deleting a browser history and how you might go about doing that. Yeah, so increasingly lots of advice from legal, commercial, and social enterprises providing advice around that question of digital assets. And I think that's obviously, and I'll come back to this towards at the end, there's still kind of ongoing, policy and regulatory kind of endeavors trying to kind of approach the task of providing a kind of standard for access and for access for the legacy of the deceased. Online memorialization then has also grown and become a kind of a standard option for people to share and post and create a memorial for a loved one. And that can be part of a kind of estate planning as well, whether what one's wishes for that kind of memorialization are. And that can take place in a number of ways. So one is obviously a dedicated online memorial, such as the example of Memories in Australia, which is owned by a large funeral company, InvoCare, that allows for a kind of range of memorial functions. And obviously there's kind of similarities across these different apps and services, but they also share a lot, intending to, around what kinds of information can be posted. So they tend to have a timeline. You can post tributes and videos and images. You can, you can do that for collaboratively. So it's not just sort of, created by one person, but created by a group. And these can persist for different periods of time based on the service agreements that you might take out with them. But of course, they provide other kinds of features as well, such as planning future messaging to our ancestors, to future family members, and so on. Of course, beyond dedicated memorials, the question of what to do with social media profiles has received a lot of attention in the research literature, and also from social media platforms themselves. Obviously, Facebook has garnered a lot of attention in this space. Over time, they have actually been quite responsive and developed their kind of legacy options, from being able to close down an account to being able to memorialize an account, to then actually allowing people to nominate a legacy who can take control of their wishes and acting on that memorialization. So the question is then what people want to do with this and with various social media profiles that they may have, and what their wishes are that they would then nominate in as part of a sort of estate planning, digital estate planning. Yeah, so, the question of whether to memorialize, to leave it sort of public or viewable, or whether to deactivate it or to delete it completely. There's different kind of options available to people. And of course, this has raised kind of questions about what it means to respect the rights of the dead, particularly around questions about privacy, the ideas of, what elements of their life should be public or not, based on, what their wishes were prior to, and respecting those kind of wishes and those rights. And so in the literature then, there's certainly been attention on, well, what does this mean, not just for memorializing the deceased, but for how we relate to the deceased, that in spaces that are kind of social media spaces. So they're about kind of the living, not the dead. They're not sequestered away. And so raising questions about kind of those kind of continuing social bonds is certainly one that has received a lot of attention in the literature, not just in terms of questions of kind of grief and mourning and ideas about bonds to the dead, but also about, in kind of other perspectives around questions of governance and managing the identity and the reputation of those who have died, when possibilities are available, not just to memorialize existing accounts, but to create new like RIP, public pages, for example, that we see on Facebook, and who gets to kind of create those and manage those. And then the other space in which we're in has been, with our research team at the University of Melbourne, some project and increased interest around the intersection of memorializing or digital memorializing with physical spaces of commemoration, so cemeteries and memorial spaces. And so I'm sure we've seen instances and examples of kind of tagging technologies like QR codes that are used to kind of link graves to online memorials. And certainly that's been something that has been around for a while, hasn't really kind of exploded, but certainly been something that you do see in cemeteries. But the possibilities for and the designs and innovation that's happening around digital technologies and developments and their deployment within cemeteries is certainly growing as well. And so that's a question then that sort of shifts the kind of the terrain, if you will, of questions around what those technologies are and what they're used and what they mean when it's not online, but in physical places, in memorial spaces that have their own kind of cultural practices, cultural histories, and cultural meanings. And so we did some work mapping cemetery technology, so technologies that intersect with the cemetery, which we've called the Encyclopedia of Cemetery Technology, which is available online for you to view and to contribute to. It's a crowdsourced database that is continuing to grow as we do further research and discover more, or we are notified of new technologies that we can add to that database. And so this database that we've created, we map technologies in different stages of design. So whether they're in prototype or they're existing or they've kind of gone obsolete, as well as across different categories. And so we could see from this analysis of different, I think we've roughly got 70 odd in there or something at the moment. So different applications and uses of technologies for intersecting with the cemetery and memorializing. Some are about wayfinding, so navigation and location-based kinds of applications. Others are about narrativizing, so adding a kind of a narrative layer to the cemetery, which might be about sort of cemetery tours or spatial narratives, or narratives about prominent graves. Some of them are about presencing, which is about kind of remote applications for visiting the cemetery. So we see remote visitation and remote grave tending and online memorials that connect to cemeteries, such as QR codes. But we also see increasingly a number of designs around gravesite media that are more emplaced. So the idea that we could, designs that are trying to sort of add a digital layer to a gravesite, whether that be audio or image or video, or even proposals around kind of augmented reality applications that people might one day want to like implement and use at the graveside. And then others which were kind of non-related to cemetery and memorial practices, but were about sort of art installations or soundscape or location-based kind of games that intersected with the cemetery or were embedded in the cemetery. So there's different kind of, we've got some research ongoing about that and how people are kind of responding to those different developments and designs and technologies. And as you could imagine, there's some kind of contradictory responses to them. These are not our designs, we're just researching them, but certainly it's an increasing kind of space of innovation and intervention. The other one, the third one then is posthumous participation, which is a bit more speculative and less kind of practical, but it's less in the kind of here and now and what people are actually doing and kind of more sort of future oriented. And so often we see it in various science fiction narratives, such as the Black Mirror episode Be Right Back Here, as well as many others I'm sure you've seen about kind of posthumous interactions or bots or forms of persistence living on online after you die, kinds of sort of science fiction narratives. But there are those that are kind of like proposing these and developing them in the present in terms of digital products and services that include kind of future messaging, applications, so you can create videos or messages that you can kind of plan to post in advance to different recipients that you may want to, send a farewell message, wish a future grandchild happy birthday in the 21st century, or as if I die, kind of suggest settle a score after you're dead. Certainly, there's been a few and more speculative design propositions around kind of creating avatars for the dead. These tend to be perennially kind of in development in beta mode and never actually kind of come into fruition, because I think their ambition kind of exceeds maybe what's possible with current technology, or perhaps what people are comfortable with thinking about. The idea that you could create an avatar of a dead loved one that looks and sounds like that person, that has been trained through a database of their kind of social media history, those traces of that they've left online, that it's been programmed through artificial intelligence, and that it can not just kind of repeat phrases but can actually kind of become an interactive kind of entity that is that of, that is a representation of that person, but in persisting beyond them, somehow kind of takes on, I guess, different characteristics that might develop over time that would suggest that it was no longer them. So there's a lot of complexities here, more in the terrain of, I guess, philosophy, about people thinking about more existential questions about ideas of living and dead and personhood and so on. If or when such kind of entities come into being, noting that until now they, such as autonomy, often just exist, even though they claim to be more as kind of vaporware or as a website or a proposition more than anything else. Although we do see real examples that may kind of signal something, more in this direction. The example here from James Vlahoff, a journalist who created what he calls Dadbot and got a lot of coverage a few years ago, where he had all these kind of oral histories of his father, so all these oral records that he plugged into a chatbot kind of platform or program, and he created a dad chatbot on his phone that he could then interact with. So it was only drawing on that kind of database of sound and tech, but he created sort of these interaction scenarios and trees that made it feel like, he argues, and you can certainly see videos from him and demonstrations of those interactions, that his father was, after he had died, was still with him, particularly the kind of voice interactive elements and recordings. So obviously this took a lot of data, a lot of effort, and a lot of know-how, something that probably shows the limits of those more commercial off-the-shelf sort of options, but certainly sort of some kind of possibility. I think I've run out of time, so I'm just going to quickly note.
Just a couple of minutes there, Bjorn.
Thank you. I'll just quickly note that the response, I guess, from a legislative perspective, is how we kind of provide some kind of standard of access given the diversity of platforms, and certainly something that's happening in Australia with the New South Wales law reform that's currently going on, to try to create a consistent scheme for access to records, questions about definitions of legacy, who gets access, transparency from service providers, and so on. And I'm understanding that this is also happening in other jurisdictions, including in the UK, that you may be more familiar with than I am, but I think there's certainly kind of moves that are happening in this direction. And I will end it there. Thank you, Mark. Apologies for going a couple of minutes over.
No worries. Thank you. And look, we'll have some questions in the chat room afterwards. So thank you, Bjorn. We may move straight on then, and Ami can get his slides up on the screen, but just to introduce Dr. Ami Nwosu, he's a senior clinical lecturer in palliative care at Lancaster Medical School, a researcher lead at Marie Curie Hospice, Liverpool, and also a former researcher scholar for the National Institute of Health Research, Northwest Coast Clinical Research Network. He's also an honorary consultant in palliative care at Royal Liverpool University Hospital. Most probably pertaining and relevant to today is that Ami is the podcast editor for Palliative Medicine Journal, which you would be familiar with. So welcome. Thanks, Ami.
Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to present. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today and to share my talk, which is called Death, Dying, and in the Metaverse, What Can We Expect? So I'll launch into it. The year is 2060, and your friend dies, and you are responsible for arranging their memorial service. They worked and socialized in both the physical and online worlds, and the person that knew them best was their AI chatbot friend that they communicated for several hours with every single day. So the question is, how could this funeral differ from ours today in 40 years' time? So, oh, sorry, I've just missed a slide out. So thanatology is the scientific study of death, dying, loss, and grief. And this is Professor Carla Sofka in 1997, who developed the term thanatotechnology, which brings together the concept of thanatology and death together. And she did this in her book, which is Death, Dying, and Grief in an Online Universe in 2012. And the online platforms that Bjorn has outlined to us has brought the discussion of death and dying into our homes. So apologies, this slide is meant to be before this, the last one, but the aims of my talk are to discuss how the internet has evolved from Web 1, Web 2.0, and Web 3.0, to consider how social media has changed the way we mourn, and then to explore how the metaverse will change the way that we remember the dead. And then once we've done that, we can then revisit the initial slide about how a funeral 40 years from now might differ from our own. So in order for us to really talk about the internet and how that affects death and dying, it's probably useful to talk about how the internet has evolved. So Web 1.0 started in the 90s and persisted till about the year 2000. And this is what we know as the first version of the internet. The first version of the internet consisted of a few people who created web pages and for large groups of readers. And imagine that we were in the high seas in a boat, really without a map. We just had a compass to navigate to certain websites. And we do this with Netscape Navigator and then Internet Explorer and some search engines like Ask Jeeves. And these websites were static websites for content browsing only. It was read only. There wasn't a peer-to-peer sharing of information, and people were anonymous. From 2000 to 2010, we see the development of Web 2.0. And this is more people creating resources on the internet for a growing audience. And whereas the first version of the internet was focused on reading, the second version of the internet was focused on participating and contributing. So this Web 2.0 is called the participatory and social web. So this is where we see Facebook start in 2004 and then open up for the public in 2006. And then other social web resources like YouTube, Twitter, and Blogger all appearing in this time period. We see social media, podcasting, user-generated content. And in order to use this, people have to use their own identities. You know, on Facebook, on Twitter, you are joining those things as you, as yourself. So whereas the first version of the internet was people being anonymous, the second version of the internet was that you were using your own identity, but you don't own the data that you post. If you post information to Twitter, Facebook, Blogger, that information isn't yours, because if those websites go down, you lose your data. When you upload photos to Facebook, they own that photograph, it's not yours. The digital assets don't belong to you, they belong to the service providers who are providing your service. So this takes us on to the third version of the internet, Web 3.0, which originated in the year 2010, but what we're really beginning to see the crystallization of many ideas coming together. The third version of the internet has ideas of decentralization, openness, and ownership of digital assets. When we talk about centralization, imagine a central bank that controls a currency. And that's what we're talking about here, of central platforms like Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft being decentralization. In a decentralized web, we're moving away from that, again, to nearly anonymous platforms, which are run and served by users. The features of Web 3.0 are artificial intelligence, machine learning, the use of 3D graphics, and blockchain technology, which we're seeing in games, for example, where people are then being able to own their digital assets with non-fungible tokens, which are called NFTs, decentralized finance, which cryptocurrency, which is supported by blockchain technology, and decentralized autonomous organizations, which are owned by communities. We're moving away from a centralized model to a decentralized framework. And here is a diagram that shows the theoretical evolution of the internet. And you can see that we're progressing all the way from the PC era to Web 1, version 1, 2, and 3. And as we carry on, what you see as the outcome of that is a web operating system. So at the moment, operating systems are kind of centered on your devices, which limit their processing power. But if you have a web operating system, which is generating data from the cloud, it means that the devices that we carry don't have to have the processing power, which means theoretically in the future that anything that connects to an internet will be able to connect to a higher process network, getting to the Internet of Things and the metaverse that I'm about to talk about. So what is the metaverse? The metaverse is the redesign of the internet into an immersive 3D continuous universe. The metaverse theoretically isn't going to be something different. It's going to be the next version of the internet. Just as we see here with Web 3.0 going into Web 4.0, the metaverse is what is happening next, coming off the heels of Web 3.0. It's based on virtual and augmented reality, creating a virtual world for people to live, work, share, and play. The idea is that the metaverse will be alongside and part and parcel of our normal life, not something that's different. So there's the potential to augment human experience and connection rather than to replace. So here's an example of Decentraland. That is a company that has kind of built and invested land in the metaverse. So again, kind of buying land, powered by blockchain technology. And Samsung is one of the first companies to have a physical presence, so people can go into the metaverse and visit the Samsung store and interact with other people in this world. And Facebook, you may have noticed, have changed their name from Facebook to Meta in anticipation that this is going to be the next big wave of the internet. And here's Mark Zuckerberg with an avatar, which just shows that he is kind of interacting with the metaverse in a different place. So what will the metaverse be like? The future of the internet is likely to be about individuals, not organizations or communities. It will be focused on ownership. So this is how people can own their own data, own their digital assets through these NFTs as we've talked about, and then own their digital legacy. It's going to be built with technology such as augmented reality, where you remain in a physical space, but you have an overlay of virtual things which are there virtually but aren't there physically. Virtual reality, where you are taken to a virtual world, and then and that should be artificial intelligence and machine learning. So this is the ability of a computer to think and act like humans. Avatars that we've already heard about, and hologram technology. Here's an example of Fortnite. You know, there's a popular game that is particularly popular with Generation Z, and Fortnite is an example of what the metaverse could be like, where you have people who are playing on this game all around the world, and Ariana Grande did a concert that was in the Fortnite metaverse. And again, this is Facebook Meta showing an example of how you can have this augmentation of people working remotely, but having avatars to feel like they're working in the same environment. So the second part of my talk is, how will new technology and the metaverse change the way that we remember the dead? So if we go to 2007, this is the Virginia tech shootings in Virginia, which at that time was the worst shooting that happened in America. And lots of students died in this. And Facebook had just launched for all users to join the year before. And relatives asked Facebook to keep the student accounts of those killed to be left alive. So what Facebook decided to do was to memorialize the accounts instead. So this is when we first started to see memorials accounts. And you know, we've had this touched upon by Bjorn. So this is what a memorialized account looks like, of remembering, and this is what a memorialized account looks like on Instagram. And again, this can produce some tension between people who want to keep an account as active, not memorialized, so that you can still keep on interacting with that person by tagging them into photos and seeing their wall and then wishing them happy birthday when their birthday rolls around, versus a memorialized account that will be coordinated by a person who may decide to restrict or kind of limit the amount of information that's on there. So this can then cause this kind of grief for other people who might want to go and see these photos, but the person that is taking control of the memorialized account might take them all off, or even delete the account, which then might feel like a second death of that person. This is Professor Elaine Casket, who has been posing this question in her book, All the Ghosts in the Machine, about who controls data to deceased. So there's the prediction that there'll be 4.9 billion accounts of dead people on Facebook in the next century. And asking these questions that we've heard before in the last presentation of who controls your data. Will your loved ones be able to access your photos and videos when you die? How will you respond now? And we've seen here that articles are appearing about what to do to prepare your accounts when you die. We've already heard about Dead Social and the Digital Legacy Association in the previous talk. So my first part of my talk, I want to reflect on how new technology in the metaverse will change the way we'll remember the dead. So, you know, this is speculative, but it's based on what is happening at the moment. And I think what we need to reflect on from a philosophical point of view is how the human and digital self are becoming increasingly interlinked. So this is a still from the Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. He's written the Dark Materials trilogy, the Northern Lights, the Amber Spyglass. You might know this, that the first film was released called The Golden Compass, I think. And this is a little girl called Lara, and in the book, all children are partnered with a small animal called a daimon. And it's this idea that human beings have got this small helper, this friend that goes along with them. And there's this link, this attachment that they have with this, their spirit animal. And you see this in other things like Harry Potter. And then you see this in Star Wars, where you've got Luke Skywalker, who's got his partner with his droids, like C-3PO, R2-D2 and C-3PO, and you see this recurring through all the different Star Wars films. In the most recent Pixar Lightyear film, if you've seen it, Buzz Lightyear here has got his AI-powered cat, who is his partner throughout the film. This is a film about a little boy who's relationship with a robot that feels like it's autistic, but it's called Ron's Gone Wrong, and all the children in school have got this partnership with their robot helper. We've seen this in Baymax as well. This robot who is got this partnership and displays human emotions. And with Snapchat, so this is Snapchat, but you can see Snapchat was one of the first apps to provide these filters. So the idea is that you have yourself, but you've got this digital overlay. And we've got a generation now of people who are very used to having these filters as part of it, or part of them, and it might feel like very much your identity. In addition to all the smart devices that we have, but anybody that's got a mobile phone in their pocket has got a smart assistant installed on there, whether it's Siri or Google or Alexa. We are carrying around these small helpers with us all the time. So the hypothesis I have is that this increased connection with digital assets will cause attachment, and the loss of digital assets will be grieved, whether that's through photos, your gaming profiles, your chat history, and that will feel like a second death. When I grew up, people didn't have these devices, and we would go and print off photos to remember things, and people would keep diaries, written diaries. I'm not sure whether people do that now, which means that the way that we are recording our lives now is through this digital network. There's TV programs in the UK, such as Who Do You Think You Are, where people will go and they will do archives to find out about somebody's life by going through their records, such as the photos, their diary entries. But if people aren't keeping archives in that way, and people are keeping their archives digitally, that's how we're going to remember our lives in the future. That's how future generations are going to find about our lives. So we have to be aware that if we then lose these, if you take somebody's phone away, if you delete somebody's social media profiles, if you delete somebody's photos, you take away their access to their apps, there's going to be a loss, there's going to be a grief, just in the same way that people grieve losing their photo albums. So the data in Web 2.0 is not owned by the individual. If you store all your information on Facebook, on Google Photos, you don't own it. If you die and you don't give permission for someone to access that data, it's gone. Your great-great-grandchild may not be able to ever see the photos of you in university, for example. But what Web 3.0 gives the opportunity is to own your digital assets. In a world which is powered by blockchain technology, where the focus is moving from a centralized approach to a decentralized approach, that gives the opportunity for people to own their digital assets and potentially to purposely create their digital legacy. So key technologies here are the blockchain, AI chatbots, augmented reality, virtual reality, and holograms. So a blockchain is a way of recording information in a way that makes it difficult or impossible to cheat or hack the system. And blockchains enable secure ownerships of digital currencies, such as cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin is a popular one that people seem to know, and digital assets, non-fungible tokens. So you just try to, this is speculative, but try to imagine a future whereby you could own your digital assets that you could then pass on in inheritance. And here's an example of it already happening. You've got a Rolex watch here that you can buy the Rolex watch, but it also comes with an associated NFT, this non-fungible token, which means that if you had your avatar in the metaverse, they could wear a virtual version of your Rolex watch. It would be yours. It wouldn't be anybody else's. There would be ownership attached to that Rolex watch in the metaverse. So in the future, that you could then pass that down to a grandchild, and it would then potentially have a value because it belongs to you, just in the same way that a Rolex watch in the physical world has an added value when you pass it down to a family member because it belongs to you. So this ownership has the potential for people to really change the way that they view digital assets. And we've already had this mention about AI-powered chatbots. So, they already exist. You can go to the Google App Store, Apple App Store, you can already buy them. You can go online and type in cookie AI, and this is a AI that's been there and it's learning through millions of conversations that it's having with people each day. And if you chat with it, it is like chatting to a human, and it will remember things about you, and it will comment about things, and it will go and research on the internet and give you information. We've got chatbots which are being developed in palliative care. So this one has been developed by Cardiff University to help people understand drug interactions. And this one has been created to try to replicate somebody who lost his wife. And now it's one of the biggest grossing apps where people are using it as developing an AI companion that is to do that exact thing. It's to be a companion, to learn about you. And there's even kind of the mode for people to have romantic relationships with the AI companion. Augmented reality, so Pokemon Go is a good example, and digital overlay or in your physical world, but we can see this in Snapchat. So Snapchat uses a feature called geolocations where you get different overlays depending on where you are. So this is Philadelphia, and we've seen this technology now being piloted this month in the NHS with people wearing smart glasses that gives you vital signs down the side of your vision. And we've also seen this concept of QR codes, but on the bottom right, somebody's designed this kind of augmented reality app. So when you hold your phone to gravestones, it gives you added information. And we've seen the information here about holograms of the dead. So Michael Jackson performing in 2014 after he died, and then Tupac Shakur at Coachella in 2012 being brought back to life after their death. And then Kim Kardashian received this gift from her husband, Kanye West, 2 years ago, where a hologram of her dad was brought back to life to give her a message. So what is this metaphor palliative care? So the metaverse is likely to be part of our daily lives. So there's the potential to experience grief from loss of digital connections and assets. And technology can potentially be used to construct digital legacies, which we can see here through people like Kate Granger, Stephen Sutton, and Deborah James, all using social media to generate this positive message, which is now living on with Stephen Sutton raising £5.5 million for cancer after his death, and Deborah James, who died this year, has raised £7.5 million for Cancer Research UK, just through their digital legacy. So how could the future look? Well, we could have AI companion that you talk to, that you train on your phone, that helps you with daily tasks. It can organize your photos and add tags to tell stories. It could then sort your archive, your social media. It could keep a record of your travel history, both virtual and physical. So this is my Google Maps, and you can see I went to the Louvre. I can't remember when I went, but Google knows. It tells me that was the 15th of November 2014. You can then work, live, and have leisure time in the metaverse, and then coordinate your digital inheritance memorialization. So the question is, what might our 2060 funeral look like? Well, we could have digital and physical memories. We could be using augmented reality, virtual reality, holograms, geo-tracking of places. We're thinking about gravestones, but why does it have to be a gravestone? Why can't it be a cafe that you really enjoyed? That if somebody walks up to, that they geolocate where you were and you find that information about what you liked about that place. You could have digital legacy making. The best person to talk at your funeral might be your AI that knows what you enjoyed and where you went on holiday and what you liked, and can actually coordinate and put things in order of what happened to your life. And there's this concept of digital immortality. If you have a metaverse that runs alongside the physical world that's always there, and you have an AI that's learned about you, that you train over 30 or 40 years, and that can be your kind of replica in the metaverse, it could continue to travel and explore based on your experience and wishes, and it could exist just to tell your story to a future generation. You could have your digital Rolex watch waiting for your grandchild to come and meet you in the metaverse, and you could ask your AI in 30 or 50 years' time to give it to your grandchild, and then tell stories about where you went to school and give instructions of how your grandchild can go and see those places themselves. So some research questions from this was, how will the traditional deaf systems be affected by this technology? What are the new theoretical models? Do new theoretical models are needed for digital immortality and death? What is the impact on bereavement by digital immortality? And how will a second death, which is turning off of digital memories, deleting Facebook posts, getting rid of all your photos, impact bereaved people? And why do some people choose to memorialize profile pages of deceased people rather than keeping the profile page maintained of a living person? So in conclusion, the metaverse is the next predicted evolution of the internet, and it may potentially change the way that we manage grief and bereavement. What it does is provide opportunities to manage our digital legacy with the potential for people to have digital immortality. However, I think more research is needed to explore this, how this technology will affect grieving before and after death.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ami and Bjorn. Just listening to you both, I was thinking that it's the beginning of the 20th century was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. It feels like the 21st century is about the brave new world. Quite provocative, I guess, in a sense, for people that this is all new information to. We do certainly have time for questions, but I've got about 5-6 minutes. I'll just share my screen again. Great, I think that's it. Let me see. Hopefully you can see my screen. Might have to, yeah. Can you see my screen just while I'm chatting?
Okay, I'm just still see you.
Okay, it's not coming up. Okay, let me give it
Sorry, Mark,
go.
I just dropped out there. Oh, sorry, you're right.
That's it. I think it's on now. So good. Okay, so I'll just go back into the questions, and I just need to. I might need to get Joe. Can you see in the chat room? I think. Sorry, I've lost the chat room now. So.
Yeah. So Ruth Mareika's mentioned that avatars have already been used successfully in heavy trauma-based bereavement. And Fiona Murphy's asked, what is the risk of harm to our younger children who may hear the voice or heartbeat of a parent online?
Great. So do either of you want to answer that question? I think that's quite a useful question to consider. Do you think there'll be potential harms from this sort of technology that we've unanticipated?
So did you call us, me, Mark? Was that what you said?
Either of you, if you'd like to answer it, yeah.
As I said, I'm in the social science, not in the medical sciences. So, I mean, I think the question of what the impact on bereaved or for grieving is kind of, I guess, outside of my sort of research area. But I mean, I think, you know, I mean, there's a lot of factors to take into account there. I mean, I guess there's the relationship, the age, the question of what type, when we talk about hearing the voice or heartbeat of a parent, I mean, I guess what kind of data are they hearing? I mean, I think if there's the question of, you know, reading a letter, you know, versus watching a video from, you know, beyond the grave, a kind of memorial video or a video left to for children, or versus kind of an interactive avatar that kind of replicates, is not that person, but replicates them and is interactive. I mean, you know, the difference between a chatbot and a memorial, and, you know, a video message from the deceased and a letter. I mean, I think they're different kinds of media, right? And they might have different kinds of effective responses. And yeah, so I think there's probably a lot to take into account, a lot of nuance there.
Yeah, and I guess just following on from that as well, it's that often this technology just allows us to think of a world where it's still the same issues that have existed previously. It's just being done in a different way. So, you know, people have been able to, you know, like you may have somebody that listens to an answering machine where you have a deceased person, and that can kind of jolt you back because you didn't quite expect it. And people may have been able to record the voice of to leave a message for a different reason, whether that be on CD or a tape. I think this is feels different because it's more instantaneous and it's easier in some ways to record this information. But I think there's going to be, you know, potential opportunities, which are great. If you think about this, the possibilities, if you now could go back and find a family member that maybe died like 100 years ago, or in the war or something, and you wanted just to find out about their life, and you had the opportunity to listen to them and see a video, you would probably really want to do that. It feels different if we're talking about different types of relationships and different types of media. So I think it's a nuanced question depending on who is the person, what are their needs, what is the kind of information that they're being exposed to.
Right.
But I also
Thank you.
think you have to really consider the developmental stages of children, because as we all know, children have this experience where they have no clue about time or place. And that might be a time of hard learning in societies, because that is also potentially very, very harmful, because they can't get out of it. And they are not able to distinguish between this world and that world. And so I think it may also generate, it will be learned in the end that they can live in two worlds, but I think that will generate a lot of learning and a lot of accidents and a lot of trouble also. But that's probably what we have to go through.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, we're coming to the end of our time. I think just on reflecting, I guess many of us working in palliative care have lamented the fact that no one dies anymore and everyone passes. So maybe the pundits that decided to call dying passing are actually going to be proven to be the ones that are right in the end. From our talks today, it sounds from Bjorn and also from Ami that indeed a digital future could mean that we don't necessarily ever die, but we go on immortally forever. So it'll be interesting as we move further in this century to see how things evolve and change, and indeed how that fits in our concepts of death and dying and our future memorialisation. So to say thank you to both of our speakers today. I'm just having trouble moving the slides now. They've had a little bit of a snooze. There we are. So thank you very much to both of you. I just want to mention that if people want to get involved, haven't been involved with the International Collaborative, certainly you can find us on the web there at the Best Care for the Dying. And there's some benefits to membership, particularly with regards to the quality improvement framework and summer school for people coming to utilise our services. And really the next webinar will be in about 3 months' time, which is around the global challenges of opioid use in the care for the dying. So thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to catching up with people in Liverpool in October, but also catching up with people again at the next webinar in December. Thank you.